So I have a really neat, really cool story to share with you today. We've been looking at the Apostle Peter the last few weeks, and during this season of Lent, we're studying what he teaches us about being a disciple despite our flaws. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Peter's call and how Jesus told him, "You will no longer be fishing for fish, you will be fishing for men and women." Last week, we discussed Peter walking on the water when Jesus called him, and how if you want to do stuff, you have to be willing to get out of the boat. And so 2 weeks ago, I challenged you to go fish. And last week, I challenged you to get out of the boat. Well, someone has been listening. This is a young person in our congregation. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't want to embarrass. But I had a conversation with this young person's dad, and he told me what had happened over these last couple of weeks. It was spring break, week before last, and their family went to McDonald's to have a meal, and they noticed a homeless woman standing in front of the restaurant. Now, it's the policy of McDonald's here that you can't go in and sit down unless you buy something to eat. Well, and obviously, she couldn't do that. She didn't have any money. So the family went in and they bought their meal, and they also bought a gift card, a $20 gift card to McDonald's. And they wrote on it, "To a beloved child of God," from other beloved children of God. And so this young person went up and gave the gift card to this woman, and she just kind of looked at it and didn't really know what to say. And Dad explained to the young person that, well, this probably doesn't happen very often, and so she didn't know what to say. And so later, as they were eating their meal, the woman came in and she was able to order something, and she was able to sit down in the restaurant. And later, this young person asked Dad, "Is this what it means to fish for people?" And Dad said, "Yeah, I think it is." Well, later in the week, the same young person and family were at the grocery store, and they saw this woman, and many of us have been there, baby in one hand, grocery bags in the other, fumbling with keys to try and figure out how to get in the car. And so the family saw that she was having a hard time, and they went up to her, and Dad said, "Can we help you? Is there something we can do?" And so the young mother gave him the car keys, and he was able to unlock the door and open it for her so she could deposit groceries and babies and all of that stuff. And afterwards, the young person said, "Wow, Dad, you just got out of the boat. I would have been too scared to do what you did." Peter has taught this young person quite a bit these last 2 weeks. Today, Peter's going to teach us the difference between being a bedrock, a strong foundation, and being a stumbling block. So we find ourselves in the city of Caesarea Philippi. It's north of the Sea of Galilee, and from Capernaum, where we were in our story last week, it would have been about a 2 days journey on foot for Jesus and his disciples. Now, Caesarea Philippi was a city that was associated with the pagan worship of Pan, the god of nature. And a temple to Pan had been constructed by, most historians believe, Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the king at the time Jesus was born. And here's a picture of that temple. When Herod the Great died, his son Philip built a city next to and around the temple, and he named it in honor of the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, so Caesarea. But there was already a city named Caesarea that had been built by Herod the Great on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. And so this town became known as Caesarea Philippi, after Philip, who built it. So this city that was known for pagan worship became the backdrop for two questions that Jesus asked his disciples. Those questions are found in Matthew chapter 16, starting with verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So 2 questions. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? In other words, what are people saying about me? And the second question, who do you say that I am? Now, this first question, what are people saying about me? How many of us spend way too much time than we should worrying about this question and the answers to it? Who do people say that I am? What are people saying about me? I know I can fall into this trap and waste more time than I should worrying about it. But here's the interesting thing to notice in this story. Jesus asked the disciples what people were saying about him, but he didn't spend any time on their answers. He didn't say, "Well, that's interesting that they think I'm Elijah." Or he didn't say, "People saw John and me together. How can they say that I'm John the Baptist?" No time thinking about their answers. Instead, he immediately asked, "Who do you say that I am?" You are the ones that I love. You are the ones that I care about. You are the ones that are with me all the time. You are the ones that know me better than anyone else. You know who I really am. So Jesus is showing us by example that we shouldn't be concerned with what people are saying about us. First, we have no control over it. And so it doesn't do us any good to worry about the things that we have no control over. And second, when we ask those who are close to us, "What are people saying about me?" it can put them in a really awkward position. And this is where we find the disciples today. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? Now, there were people in the crowd who, in all likelihood, were saying some pretty awful things about Jesus. He's a fraud. He's a farce. Who does he think he is going around saying these things, doing these things? We know that the Pharisees would huddle together in their little cliques and talk about Jesus. They were concerned about him. He was a threat to the power that they held. And so it's highly doubtful that they had really nice things to say about Jesus. Now, you know all of this stuff is going on. If you were one of the disciples, What do you say? How do you answer it? Who among us likes to tell someone that we care about that people are saying bad things about them? So the disciples go with the safe answers. Oh, they're saying you're John the Baptist. They're saying you're Elijah. They're saying you're Jeremiah. They're saying you're a prophet. And then along comes Peter. And in typical Peter fashion, he is the only one brave enough, or maybe foolish enough, to give the answer that everybody knew but was too afraid to say. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. Now, the word Messiah literally means anointed one, and it indicates when someone is anointed that they have been set apart for God's purposes. In the Old Testament, it was customary for the kings of Israel to be anointed. And so by the first century, where we find ourselves in today's story, the Israelites were awaiting an ideal king, an anointed one, the Messiah. And this person would have wonderful leadership skills, and they would be devoted to God, and they would be bold, and they would be courageous. But they would also be a great warrior. The northern kingdom of Israel, so all of the 12 tribes of Jesus except for Israel and Judah, had not been under their own rule since 722 BC. And the southern kingdom hadn't been under their own rule since 597 BC. The Assyrians carried the northern kingdom off into exile. The Babylonians came and carried the southern tribes off, the southern kingdom. Now, they had been allowed to return to the promised land, but they were still living under someone else's authority. And by the time that Christ arrived, that authority was the Roman Empire. And so the Messiah would lead a revolution against the Roman Empire, and that they would be defeated, and Israel would no longer be oppressed. And so Peter was correct. Jesus was the Messiah. He just wasn't what they expected him to be. Peter also said that you are the Son of the living God. Now, this term, the Son of God, was seen as a royal title. Both King David and King Solomon had been referred to as the Son of God. And it meant that they had a relationship with God that was similar to that of a father and a son. So Peter could have meant, when he said that you are the Son of the living God, that Jesus was the anticipated king, that he would be this earthly king that would lead Israel and restore it to its former glory. But after witnessing everything that Jesus had done, casting out demons, healing the sick, making the lame to walk again, he might have started to suspect that there was more to this Jesus than just being an earthly king. So that brings us back to Caesarea Philippi, a town that was named in honor of the Roman Empire that was built by a temple that was dedicated to Augustus. Caesar Augustus was known as the son of a god. His father Julius had been declared divine by the Roman Senate after he had been stabbed to death by Brutus. Yep, that Julius Caesar that we remember from history. By Peter declaring that Jesus was the Son of the living God, he was rebuking the emperor's claim that the emperor was a god. He was the son of a dead God. Jesus was the son of the living God. And so after Peter says this, Jesus affirms him. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Simon was Peter's given name. The name Peter was given to him by Jesus. In Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, the word was Cephas. In Greek, it was Petros. Greek was the language the Bible was originally written in. Both of the words mean rock. You are Cephas. You are Petros. And on this rock, I will build my church. That sounds like a bedrock to me. That sounds like a foundation. This is the first time in Scripture that we see the word church. Obviously, it's not meaning a building. They weren't going to bury Peter in the foundation of the church. It was referring to Christ's people, the community who together are a spiritual house. Becky read earlier for us from 1 Peter, the first letter attributed to Peter being written. Like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. We are all part of a foundation which the lives and faith of others is being built upon. My story earlier about this young person, you're a part of that. That child sees you in worship. Maybe that child has come and you've given them a hug, or they have hugged you. You've taught that child Sunday school. You've taught that child VBS. You've taught that child music and songs about Jesus. You've contributed to the finances of this ministry so that there is a place for this child to come and hear the Word of God and learn about Jesus. And we know that they're doing it because they recognized a fishing opportunity. We are all living stones. We are all Peters. But it's here where the story changes. Continuing on in Matthew 16. Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Jesus tells the disciples what's going to happen, that he's going to suffer, that he's going to die. And Peter rebukes Jesus. Maybe not the smartest idea. Bold for sure, but foolish. Confessing in one breath that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and then with the next breath, scolding him. But we've already learned that sometimes Peter's mouth engaged a few moments before his brain did. And what happens next is what I refer to as a come to Jesus moment. Only it was actually a literal come to Jesus moment. Get behind me, Satan. Jesus goes from praising Peter to calling him Satan. Now, in Peter's defense, I think his heart was in the right place. He cared about Jesus. He loved Jesus. He didn't want anything bad to happen to him. But Christ told him that he wasn't looking at the situation from God's perspective. I know I'm guilty of this. Anyone else with me? We can often make our decisions based on human logic or emotion, with little time spent in prayer or trying to hear God's voice or trying to discern his will for our lives. But even taking this into consideration, even though Peter was looking at this from a human perspective instead of a divine perspective, why that response from Jesus, that's a pretty volatile response. Well, remember that Jesus had spent 40 days fasting in the wilderness, and afterwards he was tempted by Satan. When Jesus was at his most vulnerable, at his weakest point, is when Satan came. And if Satan had been successful, if Jesus had bowed before Satan, if he had eaten the bread, any of that stuff, if Satan had been successful, then God's plan would not have been. Sometimes in our awe of Christ's divinity, we forget about his humanity. Crucifixion was a horrible way to die. It was painful. It was humiliating. Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Please let this cup pass from me." The human side of Jesus feared what was going to happen. But it was his divinity that said, "But not my will, but yours." Peter's rebuke was like a test to Christ's human resolve. That comment was a stumbling block. Jesus' human side did not want to die, but his divine half knew that he had to. It wasn't helpful for Jesus to listen to Peter. It was planting those seeds of doubt. Well, maybe I don't really have to do this. It was an attempt by Satan to use Peter's love for Jesus against Christ and plant that seed that Christ might not have to die. It was another attempt to derail God's plan. And Jesus recognized it. I don't know that he was necessarily calling Peter Satan so much as he was talking to Satan himself. Get behind me. You're not going to use this man to derail my Father's plan. We can do the same thing occasionally, unwittingly. For most of us, it's in our nature not to want to see people suffer. It's our nature to want to help people to find a way that leads to no suffering, or at least maybe less suffering. And in our attempt to help that person through a situation, we can unwittingly lead them away from God's path. And that's because we forget about something. Immediately after Jesus rebuking Peter, he tells his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." We prefer easy to hard, right? Let's just admit it. We like simplicity. We prefer self-fulfillment to self-denial. We want to avoid sacrifice and suffering and any kind of personal cost that comes with being a follower of Christ. We're happy to follow Jesus as long as there are blessings and there's love and there's mercy and the forgiveness and roses and kittens and all of those wonderful things that come from being a child of God. We love all that. Just don't ask for anything in return. Don't ask me to do anything. We like having our convenient faith that doesn't demand too much sacrifice on our part. Blessings are great. Blessings are wonderful. But if my faith is authentic, it will lead me to live sacrificially. It will lead me to serve others. And sometimes it will lead me to make decisions that I really don't want to make. in order to answer his call. And not for the sake of pain and suffering, just to go through pain and suffering, but because living as a follower of Christ, denying ourselves and taking up our cross, is what brings us a truly fulfilled life. How did you feel when I was sharing my story earlier about our little one? I hope your heart was ready to burst. I know mine was when I was listening to it. I was so happy, and not just because I was affirmed that someone is actually listening to my sermons, but I was happy because this child listened, and they didn't just listen, they applied it to their life. That joy, that happiness, at least that I felt, and I hope you guys experienced a little bit when you heard the story, that is what the life of a disciple can feel like. Now, of course, a life of discipleship isn't that way all the time. We have our hard times. We have our valleys that we have to go through. We have suffering. We have trials. But we were never promised that it would be easy. Christ warned us that it would be hard. John 15:20 tells us, Christ said, if they persecute me, they will persecute you also. But when I hear stories about this, like I did about this little one, the joy that fills my heart when I think about it, that makes all the difficulties fade. That makes all the days where I'm just like, God, I'm done. Kaput, finished, no more. Those days fade from memory. 3 things to remember this week. 1, say it with me, go fish. 1, go fish. 1, go fish. 2, get out of the boat. And 3, you don't know this one yet, be the bedrock of someone else's faith. Amen.